True.
Wow.
Power and influence.
Getting coffee.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for waiting. And now it's your turn to ask the questions. So I hope you've all thought of some interesting questions to ask Michael today. Just one word of caution before we get started. Please try and keep your questions relatively brief, okay? So please, brevity is the soul of wit, right? So please keep your questions brief, okay? So if you have a question, just raise your hand. And I'll give you the microphone. And please use the microphone because the microphone's tapped into the recording system, okay? So please use the microphone.
I'm curious why, or in your view, liberalism is so deeply rooted in the Jeolla region.
So by liberalism you mean just for opposition?
Well, I was looking at the results from the 2012 election on Wikipedia, and it said 90% of people from the Jeolla region, or at least in Kwangju, voted for Moon Jae-in. And in this past election, I think it was 80%. I lived in Kwangju for 7 years, and I have a lot of fond memories for the city and for the people in the region, because I think they really spearheaded the democratic movement. And I think a lot of people in this area, north, well, in Seoul and in most areas throughout Korea, they don't really recognize, or at least haven't until recently. Moon Jae-in went down to commemorate the May 18th memorial a couple of days ago. And I think that it was a little bit of an increased attention to what had occurred down there. But, why do you think that the people down there, and I think they really the spirit of Korea, in my view, kind of really emanates from that region. But why do you think that there's so much, it's a hotbed of liberalism?
I think, to be honest, there may be historical, sometimes when you see longer stories, articles about this subject, people start talking about Baekje and Shilla and stuff, and there may be things going back a long way. I'm not familiar with that. But in the more modern period, there were two sort of things coincided. One was that the leadership was from Gyeongnam, or Gyeongsang-do. And so, once Korea started to develop, Park Chung-hee, Chun Do-won, No Tae-yu, they were all from that side. And they favoured, initially, interestingly, as when in Park Chung-hee's revolution, there were some North Korean refugees amongst his people, and they favoured sort of companies that had been started by North Koreans, but there was a sort of internal struggle and they got pushed out, and they started favouring companies from the southeast. And then the other thing was Busan was the natural port to develop because it sort of pointed at Japan. And so for all those reasons, things were stacked a bit against China. And so when Kim Dae-jung, to be honest with you, I don't know what the story was before Kim Dae-jung. But Kim Dae-jung articulated the sort of aspirations of the China people and their sort of Han, if you like, or their emotions and their feeling of being sort of left out. And when you looked at voting patterns in those days, it was extraordinary. It was, as you described, it was, Kim Dae-jung 90%, No Tae-yu 3%, Kim Yong-sam 7%, and you can bet that 10% were probably people from Gyeongnam who were living in Jeolla-do or something. It was that extreme. We used to call him, jokingly, the king of Jeolla. I remember after the 1990, the election when Kim Yong-sam was elected, 93 I think that was, or 92, December 92, when Kim Dae-jung lost again, going down to Kwangju, just to write a story about the atmosphere. And I found that I think I went down there about 4 days later, something like that. And I went to the market, and the people in the market, I mean, one lady I distinctly remember, I said, oh, I want to talk to you about the election, and she went, hey, it's just, I can't talk about it. And what I found was, well, what they told me was that the market had actually shut down for 3 days because people felt so wretched. And so I asked people, why? I mean, you know, this is a small, what's the big deal? And one market lady said to me, you know, I worked hard all my life. My daughter and my son are in university now in Seoul. If they're ambitious to do something in their life, like they want to go to a big company or work in government or something, if Kim Dae-jung had become the president, there would be access all the way to the top for them. You know, I was talking earlier about alumni. You know, they're fellow alumni at Yonsei from Chollado would sort of be in play, but it's all been cut off, so there's no access. So it's not just that we're disappointed in the election result; we feel shut out. You know? And I think it's taken quite a long time. And interesting, the results now show there's still a lot of that there. If the Kwangju events had happened in Daegu, they might have been, they would have been received very differently here. There was not a lot of sympathy. Well, people didn't exactly know how bad it had been until a long time later, but there was not a lot of sympathy because people felt that, oh, those Chollado people, they're kind of commies anyway. You know, which is quite sad, and I had assumed that this was sort of all in the past, but it seems to be still there.
And just forgive me, one more quick question. To what extent do you think corporate power poses a serious threat to Korean democracy, and that corporate power led by Samsung? And to what extent do you think wealth inequality is a serious threat? And not only here, but I mean, around the world, wealth inequality is a major issue. But if you wouldn't mind just speaking on the threat that corporate power has increased tremendously since 2000, 2001 when I first arrived. Corporate salaries have increased, executive salaries gone through the moon. Meanwhile, the salaries for the average people have remained stagnant.
I think we're all familiar with the power of the chaebol, which frankly is a problem. I remember reading when I first came here, reading articles in the Trustee Korea Herald and Korea Times, which were, I think, only 4 pages there in those days, that the government was pledging to restrict the power of the chaebol. And every president since has been saying the same thing. And it's a real problem. There is no other country in the OECD that has this type of phenomenon except Sweden, where they have one chaebol, which is allowed to exist as a sort of a deal that goes with the government, that you put so much into R&D and you sponsor this, you support this. It's the Wallenbergs, and then we let you function. In this country, the chaebol have enormous power, and it's the reason that nothing's done about it, is apart from their leverage, is I think the country is afraid because you're tinkering with something that's been successful. I mean, let's say if Samsung collapsed overnight, it would be a nightmare for this country. So whatever changes happen have to be done rather gently, and hopefully with Samsung's cooperation. As for the divide, the rich and poor, I'm afraid I can't really answer. I'm not that familiar with that. I mean, I know that ever since I've been here, Koreans that I speak to tell me, oh, we've got a big problem. Then economists say, actually, the gap here, the wealth gap here, is one of the shortest in the world. This is the revolution that hit Korea actually went through the country. It wasn't. I once, many years ago, I met an economist, an American economist, who was a specialist in the Philippines, and we sort of. It was a Friday, some event on a Friday, and we were sort of talking away. And I offered to take him out for dinner the next night, and he said, "I don't suppose you could drive me just out of Seoul, could you?" I said, "Yeah, okay, why don't we meet? Let's meet in the afternoon." So I took him out to Kwangju, And as we got out of Seoul into Kwangju, this is like 20, 30 years ago, this is 20 years ago, so now, he started freaking out, this guy. He was, and he was like, oh my God, where's the Democratic People's Liberation Front now? He was sort of being sarcastic, but what was exciting him, he was expecting the Stone Age. Once you got out of Seoul, he was expecting extreme poverty, and what he was seeing was the same as he was seeing in Seoul. I'm not sure, I know that it's always an election issue with issues, but I'm not sure how serious this one is in this country. It's serious in other parts of the world.
In the beginning, you mentioned that there are things that you probably want to change from the first book, so I'm just wondering if you can address, like, maybe share one or two things, like new insights for this book, and especially about the new generation, like probably was born around your last book and now entering the workforce. I think a couple of days ago I called the figures, like the general unemployment rate is like 4.2, but for the young people it's like 11.2. So I sense like great anxiety if you can speak about the young generation. Thank you.
So on the first thing, the kind of framework that I tried to think of for the last book. The thing is, when you write a book, a journalist is used to writing 700 or 1,000 word stories, and there's at least 2 journalists here who've written books, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. To write an entire book is mentally a very difficult thing at first, because your instinct is to drop 700-word stories into it. So the reason I sort of struggled over this one was to try and come up with the conceptual framework for the whole book that would be sustained through the whole thing. And that's where I found I dispute what I said before. What I said before was I used the image of miracles, which is not original. It's, the miracle on the Han River has long been used to describe the economic growth. And the political miracle, I'm quite familiar with that. And I suggested that the next miracle that we're waiting for is reunification. But what I said earlier about the significance of Korea, what the Koreans have done for the world, I can't quite see how unification now is going to be that significant, because the Koreans are the last to do it. If you accept North Korea as a communist country, if you see it as something else, then maybe the unification of 2 Koreas might inspire the world in some way. But I suspect it's going to be, oh God, at last that problem's solved. What took you so long? You fractious people, you. So I thought that the third miracle is actually, it's a more nebulous thing. It's cultural, for want of a better word, but it's a kind of an affirmation of things Korean culture. It's like the world is becoming familiar with Korea in the way it's familiar with France and Australia and Canada and the UK, countries like that. The Koreans are sort of sitting up alongside it. And they've come from the back of the line in terms of knowledge and awareness. And they're familiar in terms of, the familiarity comes in terms of individuals, athletes, writers, cuisine, all sorts of, it gets expressed in different ways. But to me, I think for the Koreans above all, that is a miracle. So that's sort of a big difference, is that sort of approach. The thing about young people, you've got what I hear is it's not there's a shortage of jobs, there's a shortage of, you've got 70% of young Koreans graduate from university, and there's a shortage of jobs at that level. And I'm very aware of this because I have it in my family, my wife's family. And you have young people who dream big, and then lack the credentials. Frankly, in this society, if you haven't been to 2 or 3 universities, you're not seen as having the credentials to get to the top somewhere. And are those universities any better than the others? I doubt it, frankly. Seoul National University hires the people, takes in the people who score the highest in the Sunan. What is that a measure of? Well, it's a measure of your ability to do the Sunan. But you go through life. I mean, my wife was telling me yesterday she went to this philosophy lecture, and she was sitting next to an 80-year-old man who sort of introduced himself. The first thing he said to her was, "I went to Seoul National University." It's like he's still living off this thing. And I think what Korea needs is to encourage people to diversify their ambition.
Hi. Earlier you said you mentioned student protests, and I was just curious on what your opinion was on how they were so ineffectual that you said that they accomplished absolutely nothing.
I think I was being a bit unkind because there was a lot of sacrifice and a lot of effort and energy and sincerity went into their demos, and they were representing the conscience of the country, of the people. So I should perhaps withdraw. I don't mean it to sound as negative, but it didn't do any good. That was the problem. It didn't shift. One thing I've sort of learned about life watching this thing is if you want to go to another country and start a revolution, once the middle class come in, something changes. If the people with the power are able to identify the people protesting against them, oh, that student, okay, he's going to get a job a couple of years later. When I got friends who were in Jusapa, the pro-North Korean Juche group, one friend, a guy I know very well, he's an accountant. Do you know what I mean? It's like, if you can identify the group, but once the middle class get in, it's like, then you have a problem. And this, in the thing I was describing earlier in June, I remember sitting in a coffee shop down the road here, just as you come down from the cathedral, there was a coffee shop on the second floor, which used to be my spot for watching the demos, because Myeongdong Cathedral was the centre point of the demos. Because the police didn't go in there to grab the people, so that was the centre. And if you're a photographer, you have to go up there at the front. If you're a print journalist, you can sit back in comfort in a coffee shop and without the tear gas coming in the window and watch what's going on. And I remember one lunchtime, there's a little umbrella store and a handbag store in front of me, and it was blocked off by riot police. And there was a guy who, he must have been a banker, probably going down to KEB down here or something, wanted to go through, and they wouldn't let him through. He went berserk. He went apeshit at these people. And it was almost like 5,000 years of history was behind him. He just went totally mental. And the police started to respond. And he was saved by some ajumas wielding umbrellas. And I was thinking, what's going on here? So the students should almost dismiss. Do you see what I mean? That it's almost like this is what they do. Once it got to this point, and what happened was a very interesting moment during that 3 weeks. The Washington Post was the first one to report this is a middle-class revolution. And the government sent the Minister of Culture, and I remember I saw this, they sent the Minister of Culture up to the front of Myeongdong Cathedral to check out for himself, presumably, whether this was a middle-class revolution. And he got unceremoniously chased down the street by, by these protesters, and he ran off down the street. And I think he must have reported in and said, this is a middle-class revolution. And once they realised that, then they started to cave. So when I say the students were effective, I don't mean it unkindly. It's just in a political sense that nothing got achieved through all of the protest.
Any more questions?
Hi.
Hello. Okay. If what is with what you said about the impeachment and the institution failing, and the judiciary kind of stepping in as a balancing force, right? Am I?
Did I say that?
Yeah. Did I understand that correctly? No. So with the, I think I agree with what you said about kind of prosecutor being kind of like lawyers for the people. Like they kind of do interpret law as what people want them to do, right?
Right.
Do you think it's?
I see what you get. Yeah.
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 Do you think it's possible that them acting that way, them being kind of a objective or independent, do you think it's likely or possible?
I think actually I'm glad you asked that because I think I missed something. I misspoke because I said that the prosecutors were sort of doing the will of the people and need to find an excuse to jail. Well, of course, that's what prosecutors do, and the court system, hopefully, often in Korea, at the end of the process, if there's an appeal, then it goes to the Supreme Court. At the end of the process, often decisions are rational and fair. The problem is that the public sentiment needs to be managed along the way. And I think there are some elements of the way the prosecutors behave which need to be addressed. For example, Park Geun-hye, Lee Jae-young of Samsung, and Choi Soon-sil are all in jail. Why are they in jail? There's only two reasons to put somebody in jail before they're found guilty of anything. One is if you think they're going to run away, and they're probably not going to do that. Choi Soon-sil actually came back. And the other is if they're going to destroy evidence. And frankly, if Park Geun-hye hasn't destroyed all the evidence already, then she's an idiot. Or she'll have other people doing that for her. So that's not. So why are they put in jail? They're put in jail. And you know something? Lawyers will tell you that when a judge is considering whether to, the prosecutor has to go to the judge and ask for a warrant, whatever the word is, to jail somebody. The judge, when they're considering that, is actually wondering himself, how guilty is this person? Because if this person may not be guilty, I don't want to issue the warrant, because by them going to jail, it makes them look guilty. So the next time you see the picture of that person, they've got probably the blue uniform. Look at Lee Jae-young, the vice chairman of Samsung, is brought into a court for an intellectual crime, right? He's not guilty yet. He's brought in with ropes around his arms. This is outrageous. This is what fascist governments do. And America does it as well, but anyway, it's another story. It's called the Perp Walk in America. And I think the bit of the thing, I'm glad you asked the question, because I think the part of this is I think the courts will end up doing something rational. We might find that I suspect that the prosecutors are having a huge problem because they haven't got any evidence. And the only way that they can have a case is if Park Geun-hye, Lee Jae-young, Choi Soon-sil, or one of the entourage confesses. And so prosecutors are specialists in making you confess to their scenario. Here's my scenario. Did you do this? No. Did the president tell you to do this? No. Okay. Stand up, face the wall. This actually happened in a case. Stand up, face the wall, and don't sit down until I come back. And the guy comes back 5 hours later and carries on That's how they do it. So they'll try and break them. And then finally someone will say, well, maybe she said this. Gotcha. And then once you're in the court, you can't say, that was under duress, I withdraw that statement. It's too late. You've made it in the legal system. So this is why I think the prosecutors responding to public sentiment is problematic, because I think the system doesn't control them well.
Hello. Actually, I find your book in Singapore, one of the famous Singapore bookstore. At there, your book is interested in the recommended book for the recommended new book like this New Korean. But as in my humble opinion, Korean haven't changed dramatically. But I don't know why now Korea is very hot-ish country. Could you explain?
It's an interesting thing, and I'll take this opportunity to apologise for the title, which is not my idea. You know, publishers pick the title. The only reason it's New Koreans is because my old book was called The Koreans. And my next book is either going to be The Unified Koreans or The Brand New Koreans. So I wouldn't, it's not like the Koreans is suddenly, there's a transformation in the last 10 years. You know. But why Korea is hot? It's, I think frankly it's North Korea. It's North Korea about when Bill Clinton was president of America. When was that? 15 odd years ago. The North Korea issue before that in America had been handled in the State Department and also the military defense. Then it got to the desk of the American president. Right now, it's a top foreign policy issue for the American president. Actually, it has been for several years. And I think you might remember reading papers. One thing Obama said to Donald Trump, said this is going to be the biggest headache for North Korea. So North Korea has shone a light on South Korea. And at the same time, there's a lot of expectation that South Korean literature, movies, dramas, music, well, it's already winning prizes, but will be spreading more and more. So in the publishing world, about 3 years ago, Korea was a really hot topic, and a whole slew. But if you look back, if you type in Korea on Amazon and look at the books that have come out in the last 3 years, mostly about North Korea. You see, there's a whole bunch, and there's a lot of very good books, very interesting books, and there's kind of sub-genres, like The Beautiful Woman Who Escaped genre. There's about 4 books like that. They've all got their picture on the front. It's sort of, you know, I feel very sorry for this person. Then you've got the North Korean nuclear issue, things like that. So I think those are the 2 reasons.
Thank you. And sorry, one short question, please. Do you have any plan for translation, Korean translation for this book?
I hope this is something that happens with publishers usually. So what happens is a Korean agent sort of approaches the publisher and says, you know, let me try and find you a publisher in Korea. And then the publisher arranges a translator. And so it usually, if that happens, it usually takes about a year. So so far it hasn't happened yet. So I don't know if there's no interest. I've got Chinese. I've got Chinese language, but no other languages yet. So it all takes a bit of time.
My question is about what you make of South Korean democracy from a historical perspective. I mean, do you see it as something that has a firm precedence in Korean history, or is it the result of a kind of rupture? You know, the result of the incredible destruction of war. You know, that created a sort of vacuum. You know, for I guess foreign political system to take root. And of course, I mean, many of the sort of debates about the nature of democracy often get acrimonious when it moves into the sphere of how does it relate to civilization. For example, but of course, if you look at British parliamentary democracy, I mean, there's a kind of point of reference in the form of the rights of Englishmen, right? Which, according to which the Puritans, chopped off the head of Charles I or whatever. But I'm wondering, is there any kind of equivalent in in Korea, or do you see any kind of equivalent? And is perhaps the lack of an equivalent, does that account for the state of the rule of law in Korea, like the real absence of the rule of law here?
You're way over my head, you know. I don't know, to be honest. I don't know from the historical point of view. I mean, I'm sort of an observer of these things. I'm not really an expert in that I've studied it, so it's hard to answer. So my perspective on democracy is, and my assumption is that there were no roots for it earlier on. That it essentially came because this country was allied to America, and it didn't come to North Korea because that country was allied with the Soviet Union. But having said that, there's the sort of the fertile ground upon which I think democracy is settled here, because there's a great sense of egalitarianism in Korea, which seems to contradict the old sort of caste system that used to exist. There was a sort of social revolution that started at the end of the 19th century and went sort of through the Japanese period, where the previous downtrodden people sort of were liberated. The butchers, for example, the scum of the earth, butchers were then allowed to send their children to school. And this caused riots, apparently. And then in modern South Korea, the people who led the development here were the dictatorship, were the soldiers and the merchants, the chaebol. These are two very low-class types of people in the old days. So there was a sort of a social revolution that I think created and then the other part of it is this is also a country. Korea is an interesting place. It's a country that's bordered on three sides by the sea, and yet for centuries it's huddled in villages in the mountains. And finally, something liberated the Koreans, and they became what they should have been for centuries: traders. Koreans are great traders, Yeah, they close off their markets. Why not? Smart thing to do. It's not because they're against the outside. And Koreans sort of look at what the rest of the world is doing, and particularly America, their sort of mentor. I want that. They actually have an idealized version. I think Korea has often assumed that things European and American, North American, are better than what they have, which is not. We who come to this place know that this isn't always the case. So I think those are the factors that I can follow. I'm not sure about the historical part of the equation.
So I have a question about the Korean corporate culture. So I have found many Koreans, like my friends, especially young people, are suffering with the Korean corporate culture, like late night work or seniority, or like going hiking on weekend. So, which seems a little hard to be out of control or hard to be fixed. So I was wondering, have you ever come up with any idea to make this better, like Korean working culture better?
Work for a foreign company. We, in the PR business, which is my day job, most of the PR companies like mine have been competing to get multinational business from multinational companies wanting to deal with the Korean media. What we're starting to do now is to get business from Korean companies who want sort of their PR, not with the foreign press here, but overseas, particularly with the trade media in Europe and places like that. And so, I know at least one big PR company that had a policy of refusing to work for Korean clients because they were so abusive. We in my company, and one of my colleagues who's back there knows more about this than I do because he's involved in it directly. We've got one very famous Korean client who doesn't seem to realise that human beings have to sleep. Doesn't see anything wrong with ringing you up at 6 o'clock on a Friday night asking you to do something that's going to take 24 hours and they want it by Monday morning. But the interesting thing is that in our own company, the slightly older people, so by that I mean, let's say that people in their 20s, people who are over 35, get that and sort of see that this is what you have to do, whereas the young people don't like it at all. And I'm not sure what has caused that change. But this corporate culture thing is, some of these companies are very, very militaristic, and it kind of works when you're producing physical goods. But when you're producing, in the service industry thing, it's very interesting to see how that kind of works with where people have to be more creative. It's a very amusing thing. If you remember the movie Avatar? When Avatar came out, Samsung executives were ordered to go and see it to make them more creative. Off we go. So I don't know how this is going to be addressed, but it's also something to do with. It's not just Korea's particularly tough on this area, but there's another aspect to this I find interesting, which is that in the modern world, in sort of we're sort of living in the OECD world, in developed countries, people get their identity. Where do people get their identity from? Like, who are you? There's usually two things. In an international setting, it's what country are you from? Why is that so important? Why don't people say, oh, I'm from Busan, oh, I'm from Edinburgh? No, but we identify ourselves by country. I'm an American. Who gives a shit? The other one is by your job. So one reason people work so hard is not just they're afraid of being fired. Afraid of being fired used to be one of the reasons, but it's an identity. It's where people draw their identity from. If society changed and so Koreans were drawing their identity from other things, like I'm Jinsu's father, and I play, I do water skiing at weekends, and then when I'm asked to do overtime, I say no. Why? Because I'm running a water skiing club. If your identity, if you have other means to, and the companies aren't allowed to claim your identity 100%, that might start to change.
I have a question. I'm local. I born and grew up here. I'm here. Yes. We have a new president came, and then I don't know how much you follow the news that a couple of days ago he said that at the 18th of May, which all-part what happened in the Kwangju, 1980, for example, the first time he, as a president, he said that he will find who started it, which is a very big news for us. So something like that, based on your experiences, it changed something in Korea? Like, it's just the media saying, or I think I realized that there are many information that we were brainwashed in the wrong way, and then now I feel like many young people, we are trying to find what it is about. So do you think it's just because a new presidency came, is just something happening, or can you see that actually it really changed compared before what happened in Korea?
You mean specifically about what happened in Kwangju?
Yeah, for example, like I think he's something. I think it's very new compared to the other president. Kind of radical, statement. The way how he's doing looks much better than before. I don't know how much true or not, but so far. So it's just something new to you, for you to see that as a Korean president or something like that. Or?
Well, there were. I'm trying to remember when this was now. When was it that, Don, can you help me with this? When was it that No Myung became famous with the Kwangju hearings? Was that under No Tae-woo? The hearings into Kwangju?
Was it?
Was it? Ah, okay. I thought it was earlier than that. But anyway.
Went through the No Tae-woo presidency. He
served his full 5 years, and then they didn't go after him until we know something.
But I think under No Tayu, if I remember, were the first National Assembly hearings.
No, I remember it was 89 or 90.
Yeah, I think it was, yeah. So anyway, so going back, there were sort of investigations, and it was kind of left a bit hanging. You know, Chunduan and No Tayu, as Don Kirk just said, were tried for this and sentenced. Chunduan was sentenced to death. So there has been a lot of investigation. I think but there's a feeling that we don't know everything yet. One of the things I think President Moon was referring to was there was a point during the events in Kwangju when that you were there, right? Yeah, Don, you was down there. So where there were people, soldiers shooting from helicopters at the people. You wanted to find out who gave the order. It's like to try and get the specific responsibility. So I think that's good, but that sort of thing has happened before. You know, Kim Dae-jung's people had a list when he came in of things that they wanted to investigate, and they didn't get to all of them. Under No Myung, there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was it called, that started to research into the thing. You know, when the Korean War broke out, the South Korean government massacred tens of thousands of leftist prisoners. And in those days, it's enough for your neighbour to see you've got a book for them to shop you and say you're a leftist and you just get... I actually have a friend whose mother was killed like that, whose grandmother was killed like that, because my friend's father, as a young man, was arrested by the police for being a leftist. And so his mother, along with his sister, their mother went to the jail and bribed the guards to change places with them. And she got executed. And this is all because a neighbour shot them. So these, you know, these very dodgy things. But the Truth Commission started to look into this, and they identified victims and things like that. Then Lee Myung-bak government stopped the funding for that, because I think it was a feeling it was sort of getting political, and the left was using it against the right. So there's still a lot more of that. So I think from the investigation point of view, I think that's a good thing, and I'm sure they'll look into something, and they'll probably find that there were local commanders who made decisions, unfortunately, you know. The other part of it I found interesting is he said something, I forget how he put this now, but he said something about he was going, in the rewriting of the Constitution, there was going to be a mention of Kwangju democratization movement, right? And a lot of people would think, what are you talking about? That wasn't it. That was the Kwangju Uprising, as it was called, before it became called the democratization movement, was a reaction against brutal policing. And the real problem was when martial law came in around the country, they stupidly sent special forces down to the universities at Kwangju. Special forces are trained to kill people, and they started behaving as special forces, and the citizens reacted. So that's what happened in Kwangju. It wasn't sort of a pro-democracy movement per se. You see what I mean? So a lot of people think, oh, what are you talking about? That's what it was. But I think it's very important, because I'll try and express this briefly. I think Koreans have a huge dilemma on their hands about national identity. Okay, we see ourselves in Korea as part of an ethnic group with a long history. And our modern identity goes back to, some people say it started with the Samuel movement, you know, when there was the first sense of nationhood and stuff like that. And we got liberated from Japan, then divided, and there was a war, and now we've got the North Korean movement. But there are some huge difficulties with this. One is, for example, the South Koreans suffered more in the 4 years after liberation under their fellow Koreans than they did under the Japanese for 40 years. And then you had a war. There were more people killed and brutalized from 1945 to 1950, before the war, than had been by the beastly Japanese. That is a fact. But when I've said this to people, I hope nobody here is upset about this, but it makes people furious. And they almost sort of say, well, being killed by a Korean isn't a problem, it's being killed by a Japanese. Okay, tell that to your wife. And other things, the comfort women story. There's people, they're trying to put scholars in jail for researching on this. Why? Because there's a narrative, a myth here, that these women were all frog-marched into brothels by beastly Japanese. You know, the truth is more complex there. And the difficulty of dealing with it is because how can we, we love our country, so we deny that we were like that. The solution is to find your identity as a democracy. Before we were a democracy, we weren't very nice. This is why, as a British person, if you start telling me about the atrocities committed by British people, I share with you that they're awful. I don't try and defend them, because my identity is sort of with as a civilized Britain. Do you know what I mean? So I think for modern Korea needs to find its identity in its new identity as a democracy. Then it can explain all the bad things, or we weren't a democracy then. And that's why putting the Kwangju incident in, this is all part of the democratization story. Putting that in the Constitution, I think, is very profound.
I'm afraid I think that's actually all we have time for. Maybe one very short question.
Suddenly all that hand.
Andy, I think
just following up on what you were just saying, or some of what you were just saying. How do you explain the phenomenon of corruption in this country? We had a case the other day where a prosecutor was giving great envelopes of cash to younger prosecutors for their good work, and of course, President Moon has gone after them. But it just seemed amazing to me that after all these cases that we've been reading about, the prosecutors would be caught red-handed, literally, handing out hundreds of thousands of cash in envelopes to younger prosecutors for their good work, and apparently not going after somebody that maybe they should have been going after.
Well, Don, you're a journalist, so you look at corruption as a bad thing. I look at it as a kind of...
This is an interesting thing.
I look at it as a sort of a clash of virtues. I think a senior prosecutor spreading largesse, back in the 50s, bureaucrats in this country, their salaries were not enough to feed their families. This is why they leveraged their positions to get money. There was they were expected to do that, and we've broken away from that. But there's also a cultural thing. It's a virtue of looking after your juniors. If you go out for a lunch with your juniors, you have to pay. And so I'm not justifying that the prosecutor's doing that. I'm trying to explain why it might happen. But from the point of view of a whole society, what might be virtuous in a small group then no longer applies. When you've got prosecutor, I doubt if he's saying, yeah, mate, you dropped that case, well done, here's a few quid. I don't think it's like that. I think it's sort of largesse. I'm as puzzled by you. Why you open up the paper every day, there's cases every day. Why this keeps going, I've no idea. I think I think a lot of people must feel. I mean, there's so many stories about this over the years. There must be some people who've been done several times, you know, and it must just be that most people get away with it, and the ones who don't sort of think, oh, bad luck. But I do think the country is improving, you know, step by step on that score.
I just have two questions. The first one is really quick, but and it's a little self-indulgent, but I lived in Sapporo, Japan about 25 years ago, and I had a friend there. You're originally from Salisbury, is that correct, in England?
No, my daughter was at university there.
Oh, okay. Well then...
but I've been there.
Okay, well he was from Salisbury, and I just wanted to ask if you might have known him and his family, but it's not. It's probably...
Not Harry.
Okay. So nix that one. The other question is, one of my friends from Japan I hadn't seen in about 20 years, just by chance, was in town at a hotel not far from here the other day, and he's nervous about Abe Shinzo. He thinks that it's possible that Japan may return to this sort of more militaristic approach, and he said he thinks that right now the country is evenly divided, about 50-50 between, you know, pro and anti-military, as far as, you know, using the military as an aggressive force instead of as a defensive force. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and especially in relation to what's going on in North Korea and Kim Jong-un's antics.
Yeah, I think I mean, I understand the concern, and that I think that concern is sort of a domestic one within Japan. You know, will he change the constitution, and will Japan start to get involved in international peacekeeping and other invasions? And I somehow doubt that will go that far. But certainly the Japanese are extremely concerned about North Korea. If you notice, every time they test a missile, you know which direction it goes in. And if the Americans were to hit the North Koreans in some way, they wanted to retaliate, what better way to do it than fire off a missile in the direction, you know. So I think there's a concern there, which is quite sensible. The other thing I would point out is that should not bother South Koreans. You know, this whole thing about Japan is weird to me. These countries, South Korea and Japan, are the two most natural close allies in this part of the world. If you look at countries in terms of their values, so going back to what I said about being a democracy, Japan is a democracy. Whatever it did 70 years ago, press ganging young men to become prisoner of war camp guards, and women comfort themselves, that was when it was a fascist military country. It's a democracy now. It's an advanced, very civilized country. And I'm sure you agree that Japanese people you know are very nice people. It's not like they've all got horns sticking out their heads, you know. And South Korea is a democracy. Believes in, you know, market economy, freedom, respect for human rights, and all that sort of thing. So these are natural allies because China doesn't believe that yet. Hopefully it will quite soon. North Korea doesn't believe that yet. Hopefully it will, you know. But these countries are allies. They're also both American allies. So the idea that Korea is somehow threatened by Japanese militarization, I think, is some kind of knee-jerk emotional reaction to, you know, what you've been taught at school about history.
Okay, I'm afraid that really is all we have time for. So can we please give our special guest a very loud round of applause? And we just have a couple of small bits of business to take care of before we go. So, Michael, are you happy? Yeah, sure. You can take some photographs. But are you happy to sign some books afterwards? Okay. So if you haven't, if you've got a copy of the book, then Michael is going to sign it for you. There's still a couple of copies left. If you haven't bought your copy yet, then please do so before speaking to Michael about getting it signed. And the other thing that we have to do, Michael, would you do our prize draw for us? Will you do that for us? Okay, so does everybody have their raffle ticket, their raffle number? Okay.
Okay. You're going to announce it?
Okay. So if your number's chosen, please just come down and there's several books for you to choose from. There's some really great books to choose. There's some less great books, but there's some really great books. James Brady's The Coldest War, about the Korean War, which is very good. And Han Gang's The Vegetarian. And several other choices as well. Okay, so there's some good stuff there, right? There's some good stuff.
That's my one sticking to the side of the...
Right, yeah, someone told me they wanted 49, so it's 49. Okay. 26.
26.
26. 26?
Oh, that's a fake.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, help yourself, yeah.
Any preference?
Oh. Two fat ladies. Oh, no, clickety click, 66.
Oh, so that was the last
So that's a reference to
person.
bingo.
Oh, really? Do we believe her? Yeah, sure, it's okay. Yeah. Were you the last person to come? That was 66. Yeah, really? Is it? We believe you. Yeah.
Does anybody else think they have 66? Okay, thank you. $29.
29? Yeah, okay, come.
My friends, which he left.
Okay. Okay, fine, yeah, sure.
Is that left or left?
Okay, 6.
6.
6. Two more to go. Oh, thank you.
15.
They're all changing. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
40. I see this.
Yeah.
And the last one, 63. 63?
63, no? No?
No. 18.
Okay. And one last thing, so just to remind you, so please come back next month, June 10th, and meet Bae Soo-ah. So she's a very interesting person, very talented writer. Please come and meet her on Saturday, June 4th with Korean and English translation. Okay, so Korean and English translation. And then June 24th, come and see this fantastic documentary from Nepal with Korean and English subtitles, and hopefully some people involved in making the documentary will be here to talk about it afterwards.